Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for the Grasp on Robotics series. Just as quick reminders, this and previously recorded talks can be found on our YouTube channel and website. Also, throughout the talk, please submit your questions using the button at the bottom of your screen. These will be answered at the end of the talk during the Q&A panel. Now, I would like to introduce our Grasp faculty host for today's talk, Dr. Vijay Kumar, Dean for the School of Engineering here at the University of Pennsylvania. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabby, and hello, everyone. It's a real pleasure to introduce Lynne Parker, the Deputy CTO of the United States of America and Assistant Director of Artificial Intelligence at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. It's a real honor to have her here today. I want to just tell you a little bit about her. So she's spent about 2 years now working at OSTP. Before that, she was the director of the Division of Information and Intelligence Systems at the National Science Foundation from 2015 to 2017. She was distinguished R&D staff and group leader from 1994 to 2002 at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. Between those two stints, she was a professor at the University of Tennessee from August 2002, and actually she's still a professor there on loan to the National Science Foundation and then to the White House. And I should mention she also served very briefly as the interim dean of the College of Engineering at the University of Tennessee. Lynne has had a distinguished career as a researcher in robotics. You can see this from her bio or a quick scan of her Google Scholar profile, really amazing list of publications. But let me just mention a few honors that I'm personally aware of. So first, she's a fellow of the IEEE and AAAS. She's a winner of the US Presidential Earlier Career Award. And she's one of the top researchers in multi-robot systems, having written a lot of the early seminal papers on multi-robot systems architecture. But today she's here to give us an overview of all the initiatives in Washington, D.C. headed by the White House on AI. Lynne, over to you, and I'll advance slides when you tell me to.
Thank you so much, Vijay and Gabby. It's great to join everybody today. And I do want to tell you about all the different activities that we've been involved in over the last 2.5 years or so as it relates to advancing American leadership in AI. If we go to the slide number 2, as you all hopefully are aware, back in February of last year, just over 18 months ago, the President Executive Order that establishes our national AI strategy for advancing American leadership and maintaining American leadership in AI. It's done with the recognition that there are a lot of important advantages to AI beyond just the technical aspects. Certainly AI is touching nearly every sector of our society. And so because of that, it can be used to grow our economy. Certainly it has national security implications, and it also can improve quality of life in many kinds of applications. So we've been working since then to advance a number of the activities and actions called for in this executive order. So the next slide then organizes the work that we've been doing into 6 primary pillars. There are a number of pillars here. Obviously, I'm not going to have time to go into detail on all of them. So the ones that I want to on today are first of all the prioritizing AI R&D. There certainly, in order to maintain any leadership in the field, obviously we need to continue to push the advances at the cutting edge of research. And so this is a key priority of the American AI Initiative. Another pillar I'll talk about is the bottom left one there, removing barriers to AI innovation. This is about looking at the challenges that we have of transitioning the work that comes out of the good research labs and then puts it into the private sector and to commercialization. And what are those barriers? How can we address those? Next, let's talk just very briefly about training an AI-ready workforce to do education and work to provide people with the skills needed to engage in the current AI industry. And then I'll talk about the international environment, American AI, and a number of international activities that we've done and the importance of cooperating internationally in this area. I won't have a lot of time to cover the other two areas. One is Unleash AI Resources, which is about data and models and computing resources, nor the use of AI within the government itself, but we have been doing some other activities there as well. So slide 4, let's talk first now about prioritizing AI R&D. So on slide 5, one of the big efforts that we are really proud of is that the President has committed to doubling non-defense AI research and development over 2 years. So this is by fiscal year 2022. So this chart shows the federal budget for non-defense AI R&D. For the first bar is the FY20 request. This is the President's request. The middle bar is the FY20 budget as enacted by Congress. And then the FY21 request is the one that the President released earlier this year. And we're very much on track to that doubling commitment. This is just, I think it's around 54% in the President's FY20 request. So we're definitely making great progress in increasing the non-defense AI R&D. The bottom shows the NITRD AI R&D investment dashboard, which you can use to get a little bit more detail about this. Now on the next slide, slide 6, goes into a little bit more detail about where these increased investments are going. NSF is certainly the area where most of these investments are going, these additional investments are going. And that's really important because the foundational advances in AI are what have led us to today. It's the long-term basic research investments from the 60s and the 70s from the federal government that has eventually now led to today, where AI has application in nearly every walk of life. And so we recognize the importance of these fundamental investments, and NSF is the place that does this fundamental investment. So their budget, their proposed budget for FY 2021 is over a 70% increase from FY 20. USDA also has a significant increase compared to their earlier budgets as well for the application of advanced technologies that includes AI to agriculture systems. NIH is investing additional money as well in the use of AI for chronic diseases. Now, it's also important to note that since NSF also has a core core part of their mission is to also advance the education and training of our workforce, an additional $50 million beyond this doubling commitment at NSF is going toward increasing the diversity of our highly skilled American workforce. And so the $50 million at NSF is going to go toward AI and quantum information science workforce development, and with a particular focus on community colleges, HBCUs, and minority serving institutions. And then just as a note, even though this doubling commitment is for non-defense AI R&D, there are also increases in the defense AI R&D. So just a note here at the bottom that DARPA is also increasing their AI investments, as is DoD's Joint AI Center. So on to slide 7 then, this shows you the breakdown across the federal agencies of this FY21 request. You can see there NSF is over half of the overall request, and then you can see the breakdown by other agencies. Many of the main players are USDA, DOE, and NIH. And again, that investment dashboard at NITRD, you can actually dig into how the allocations of investments at different agencies are changing over time. It starts with FY19. FY19 was the first year we had summarized by agency the federal investments in AI R&D. So now that we have that mechanism in place, we can continue to use that to track our investments over time. So now moving on to slide 8, if you really want more detail, there's also this report, which is NITRD Supplement to the President's FY21 budget. And that also gives you some programmatic details. It's quick, it's short, but it gives you some details on where you can find the particular programs at these agencies that are investing in AI. So overall, $1.5 billion in non-defense AI R&D is what is requested for AI R&D. Okay, Moving on to slide 9. Now, these increased investments don't just come out of the blue. Since FY19, the 20 and 21 budgets, OSTP has been calling on agencies to prioritize AI R&D. If you look at those memos, you can find that AI is one of the very first things mentioned in terms of areas of research that agencies should prioritize. And that's now being reflected in these significant budget increases in AI. AI is also an important part of other national strategies, such as the National Security Strategy and the National Defense Strategy, recognizing that AI, as I mentioned earlier, is really touching on all parts of the nation's mission, including national security and defense. Okay, moving on to slide 10. One of the great things now about having these additional investments available can now do larger scale funding. And so just recently, NSF announced the National AI Institutes, the first 5 primarily funded by NSF, and then 2 more primarily funded by USDA, NIFA. And you can see from this chart that these are large institutes that are multi-partner efforts. And I know this is kind of an eye chart. You can certainly see the geographic diversity here, but they cover a lot of different topics as well. So it's a lot of topical diversity. So just quickly, since I imagine it might be hard for you to read, starting from the left there, one is on a research institute on trustworthy AI for weather, climate, and coastal oceanography. And that's being led by the University of Oklahoma. Another one, a USDA institute being led by UC Davis, is on next generation food systems. A third is on the foundations of machine learning. So this is led by University of Texas at Austin. And then there's an institute about student and AI teaming being led by University of Colorado at Boulder. Another USDA institute is on future agriculture resilience, management, and sustainability, led by UIUC. UIUC has another institute on molecular discovery, synthetic strategy, and manufacturing. And then finally, the 7th of this first set of institutes is on AI and fundamental interactions. And so that's being led by MIT. So altogether, these are $140 million of investments over 5 years. And it's certainly the most significant single federal investment in AI research and workforce development that's happened to date. You can get more information on all these institutes on the NSF website there. So then moving to slide 11, hopefully you saw that there's a new announcement as well for next year's set of National AI Institutes. These will be announced probably next summer. It'd be probably around 8 AI institutes, and the same federal partners, NSF and USDA in particular, but this time there's also some private sector partners, Google, Accenture, Intel, and Amazon. So together, these institutes will have about $160 million of funding. And you can see there on the slide the 8 areas of emphasis. I'm not going to read all of those, but one of the important aspects of these institutes is that they allow multi-sector, multi-disciplinary approaches to thinking about AI, not only in advancing fundamental research across the board that would allow you to use, say, a new machine learning technique that would apply to any application, but also digging very deeply into some transformative or use-inspired applications of AI, such as the agriculture area or computer network systems or biology and so forth. So these institutes are covering both the fundamental research that it advances AI in general, as well as how we, in a very novel way, can advance AI through a use-inspired approach. And so there's a lot of opportunity here, obviously, going forward, and we're looking forward to seeing what the next round of AI institutes will look like next year. So moving on to slide 12, just very quickly, certainly in research and development, you can get a sense from looking at these institutes that there are a lot of different topical areas that are of interest. But guiding the overall investments across all of the federal government is the National AI R&D Strategic Plan, in particular the 2019 update. This update came out last year. If we move on to slide 13, you'll see the first 4 strategies here, and these strategies are actually the same as the 2016 R&D Strategic Plan. If you read the report, it goes into a little more updated detail on each of these. But as the new plan was being prepared, the old plan was being updated, the first 4 strategies here continue to be critically important: making long-term investments in AI research, looking at human-AI collaboration, recognizing that AI is rarely going to, well, in some cases it will be used in isolation, but in many, many cases it will be used together with people to help people, say, in decision-making. We also have a lot of research that's needed in terms of understanding and figuring out how to address the ethical, legal, and societal implications of AI. So that's an important strategic area. And another one is on the safety and security of AI systems. A lot of research is needed to figure out how exactly we can ensure that. If we move on to slide 14, then the next 3 strategies here are also reflected from the 2016 version as well, recognizing the importance of sharing public data sets and environment for AI training and testing, coming up with methods for how we evaluate AI systems. How do we measure AI technologies? And so a lot of work there on standards and benchmarks and test beds. Of course, workforce continues to be important. There's a lot of research that's needed to understand how we can perhaps anticipate the impact of AI on the workforce, or how we can better train the workforce in terms of what's a good research approach to figuring those things out. And then finally, the strategy 8 is the new strategy from compared to the 2016 version. And this is recognizing the importance of expanding those public-private partnerships. The institutes are a great example of how that is coming about with this next year's announcement that includes private industry as well. But it also, in many other ways, is these partnerships can help us, again, bring together expertise from a lot of different angles so that we're not only advancing the theory of AI, but we can also advance the practice of AI. Okay, so moving on then to slide 15, if you want even more detail about how progress is being made in each of these strategic areas, last year we put out this report on how the R&D has progressed according to this strategic plan since 2016. So the message there is that all the agencies working together are critically important to advance the breadth and depth of the innovative concepts that are pushing the state of the field. Okay, so moving on to slide 16, let me touch for a few minutes now on removing barriers to innovation. So slide 17 talks about one of those barriers. If you're thinking about how do you transition the development at the lab into commercialization or the private sector, one of the hurdles, one of the barriers is the need for technical standards, AI technical standards, because we need to have an ability to measure and evaluate how these AI systems perform in terms of their reliability. Or are they trustworthy? Are they secure? Are they portable, interoperable? And these kinds of questions are answered through the development of AI technical standards. Well, NIST, of course, has led the way in this area for many years, but it's also important for all of the federal government to think about the kinds of uses of AI that they need to advance their missions, and then be able to engage in the development of the technical standards to inform the kinds of questions, the kinds of capabilities that the different agencies will need, and then work together with NIST toward the groundwork that's needed to develop these AI technical standards. So this report was released in August of last year, and it was based on a lot of feedback that NIST engaged in. We go to the next slide, slide 18. NIST also has a number of other ongoing activities that are also informing the development of AI technical standards, measures, and metrics, and so forth. They have a webinar series that's going on right now and engaging again with the industry and academia and nonprofits and civil society and so forth, particularly focusing on issues of trustworthiness in AI. And so those are, be sure and look for those. There's a series of these. They've had a couple in August, but they're going to continue to have others. And then they also are doing a number of papers for public comment. So there on the right-hand side, you see NIST Ask AI to Explain Itself. This is a paper that's out now about explainability in AI, and it's open for public comment. I think you only have about 3 more days. The public comment period, I think, ends later this week. But this is the process that they go through in order to gain information from the experts in the community about how to address these issues so that then we can work toward technical standards for AI, for trustworthy AI. Moving on to slide 19, another type of barrier is the sort of regulatory guidance that we need to look at how AI is used in the private sector. So earlier this year, OSTP worked closely with OECD to release a draft guidance on the use of AI in the private sector. This is a first of its kind approach that defines regulatory and non-use of AI in the private sector. This was released for public comment. We got a lot of good feedback, and so the final version will incorporate all of that public feedback. And it's based on a number of goals. If you read that memo, it has about 10 or so principles for how you consider the regulation of AI in the private sector. But it's about ensuring public engagement, limiting regulatory overreach, and promoting trustworthy AI. Again, we won't be able to take good advantage of AI in practical applications if people don't trust it. And so this is one additional step, another barrier that we need to overcome, which is making sure that we're all on the same page in terms of how we think about the use of AI in the private sector. Okay, so I'm going to quickly move through these last two on slide 20, training AI. Slide 21, what we're doing in the AI space is certainly recognizing that in order to train particularly more domestic people who can engage in an AI, in the AI industries, we need to look at this through the whole life cycle of education and training. And so we're leveraging things like at the K through 12 level, the federal 5-year STEM education strategic plan, which emphasizes the importance of computational thinking. Or at the other end of the spectrum, on the workforce side, once adults are already in the workforce, we're leveraging the work of the National Council for the American Worker, which is has formed partnerships with industry to where industry is providing training opportunities for people to learn new skills that are relevant now in this era of AI. Throughout this entire spectrum, we continue to want to encourage people to think about education and training as a lifelong learning experience. But certainly I think the audience here today is interested in particular that deep expertise in the middle of those who go to college, go to grad school, and want to become the leaders of pushing the edge of technology, pushing the cutting edge, so that we can continue to, at the national level, be the leader in innovative new technologies. So one of the things then that we have done there is to prioritize fellowships and scholarships for those who want to study AI. So if we move to slide 22, we did an inventory across the federal government of all the agency fellowship, scholarship, and training programs where people who want to study AI can get these assistance, get this assistance. I know this is an eye chart. If you go to our American AI Initiative Year 1 annual report, you can see that list and then study it in more detail. But the point here is that the agencies are stepping up. They are providing more opportunities for people who want to study AI to get the kind of financial assistance that they need so that now we can better train the next generation of experts that are coming out of our colleges and grad schools. Okay, now, and finally, in the last few minutes on slide 23, we'll tell you a little bit about what we're doing on the international front. Slide 4 talks about how in this happened in May of last year. The United States led in the development of the OECD AI principles. This is a multi-stakeholder activity, included industry, academia, governments, to come together to define what those principles all of the democratic like-minded countries can view are important for the stewardship of trustworthy AI. So if you go to slide 25, you'll see what these principles are. And they come into two sets. One set is about the kinds of characteristics about the AI that we want to see in the AI itself. Things like inclusiveness or fairness, transparency, explainability, robustness, security, safety, accountability, and so forth. And then the second set is about the types of actions that governments should take to foster this stewardship of trustworthy AI. And you'll see these 5 things: research and development, a digital ecosystem, a policy environment, human capacity, and international collaboration are very reflective of the American AI Initiative. And so these activities, this set of AI principles then is really kind of a starting point in some sense, getting us all on the same page of saying how we want to think about how AI, the characteristics of AI and how it's used, and then also what governments should do to foster this trustworthy AI. It's an historic intergovernmental statement. It was agreed to by, now has been agreed to by 44 nations. And so the continued work stream at OECD is in the OECD AI Policy Observatory. That image there on the right-hand side shows the landing page of that. And that observatory is collecting the AI policies from around the world so that we can compare notes and learn from each other and figure out how to advance, again, not only just how we use the AI. Slide 26 talks about a more recent partnership that the United States joined in on. In May of this year, OSTP led G7 Technology Ministerial. And at that ministerial, the ministers agreed to launch GPay together with several other democratic countries. And again, the point here is to look at how the research can inform the policymaking. This activity is actually part of the OECD, but OECD looks in particular at how do we define policies or help nations define policies for the use of AI. And GPay is helping us with by taking advantage of the expertise from around the world, from people from industry and academia, civil society, and governments, and bringing all of that together to look at a survey of the research that can inform important policy areas. So right now, the topics that are being explored include responsible AI with a particular focus on AI and pandemics, data governance, future of work, and AI innovation and commercialization. And this is really an effort, again, to make sure that as AI is being deployed by governments, but certainly industry as well, that it's deployed in a way that we agree with, that it's not in advancing authoritarian purposes, but rather democratic, free societies are benefiting from these applications. And then one last thing, and on slide 27, just a couple of weeks ago, we announced a new declaration of cooperation in AI R&D with the United Kingdom. So this is a US-UK declaration of cooperation. And this is really, if you look at the R&D strength of the nations of the world, certainly the UK with their advances in AI are a leading country, no question about it. And so by joining forces through collaborative research projects or through exchanges of researchers and student collaborations, and also public-private partnerships, through this mechanism, we can accelerate both of our nations' advances in AI. Certainly the US and the UK both have a very pro-innovation mindset. And so that is what particularly strengthens this cooperation, so that now we can work together more deeply to really accelerate the advances that both of our nations are making. And certainly the federal agencies on the U.S. side that I've been talking about today will be the ones that will be implementing this through opportunities for collaborative research and, again, student exchange and so forth. So we had a great meeting with the UK and with some of our federal agencies a couple of weeks ago, and this is an active area where we're forming a working group to ensure that we define concrete, tangible steps that we can take and make this more than just a piece of paper, but actually work toward those technological breakthroughs through concrete actions that we're taking. Okay, so with that, on slide 28, it comes back to those 6 main pillars we're working on, and then on around the edges there are a number of the actions that we've taken in all of these areas. We believe that collectively this has given us great progress in all of these areas, in research and development, in areas of data, and looking at what the barriers are to translating this, the great advances out of the research lab into practical use, areas of training the AI workforce, promoting an international environment, and then also leveraging AI for government services. So then if we move on, just very quickly, slide 29 just summarizes some of the main messages I hope you get from my presentation today. First and foremost, as called out in the executive order establishing the American AI Initiative, is that continued American leadership in AI is of paramount importance. Second is that the United States must promote sustained investment in AI R&D, or otherwise we cannot be a leader in AI. Third is that we have to reduce the barriers to the use of AI technologies, because it's not just about having the great ideas from the lab if we don't know how to actually use those to improve quality of life. The next slide then has 2 more messages. Certainly training current and future generations of AI, of American workers, so that they can engage in the cutting edge industries is critically important. And then of course, international collaboration is also important, so that we can work together with like-minded partners to advance the use of AI in a manner that's consistent with democratic values. And then the next few slides, slide 31 and going forward, give a number of resources if you want to learn more about some of the things I've touched on today. Nearly everything that I talked about has a document of some sort that you can get more information on. Slide 31 and then 32 talks about some of the R&D and the technical standards. Slide 33 talks about the regulatory principles. I didn't have time to talk about a couple of the summits that we have had, but those have also informed our actions as well. And then slide 34 shows some of the links to the international activities. Then finally on slide 5, if you haven't discovered it, AI.gov is the portal that summarizes all of the activity that's happening across the federal government in AI. If you look on that screenshot in the upper right side, there's a resources link, and that link will take you to the different URLs that I just mentioned on the previous slides, plus a number of other resources as well. So with that, I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you all, and I look forward to engaging with the students on the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lynn. That was great. Appreciate your taking the time and spending this afternoon with us. Let me hand it over to our student panelists, and let me first introduce them. Tahia Salam, PhD student in Electrical and Systems Engineering; Nicole Chu, Masters of Robotics student and a recent bioengineering graduate; and Walker Gosrich, PhD student in Mechanical Engineering. Tahia, take it away.
Hi, Dr. Parker. Thanks for your talk. So I'll get started with the first question. It's clear that you've had a really long and diverse career filled with a lot of different roles. You've worked in university, you've worked in national labs, and finally in government and policy. Can you speak a little bit about your career path and specifically what led you to your current role?
Sure. And I will preface this by saying that in my career, I have always looked at what is it that I'm doing right now, and do I feel that I'm having the most impact of in what I'm doing now based on what my interests are and what I feel that my skills and my areas of contribution are. And so it's not like I started off in grad school with this grand plan of, you know, I'm going to end up at the White House one day. It would have been a cool plan, but I didn't think of that at the beginning. But along the way, for me, it's always been about impact and how can you have the most impact on your community, on whether it's your research community or the students or the nation or even internationally. And so for me, I think research, I love the research part. I love looking at challenging problems and coming up with interesting and cool solutions and ideas for how to overcome and advance the field in different areas. So that research thread is something that I've always loved and I continue to love. And at the National Lab, obviously, you're fundamentally doing research, and it's a great opportunity. And at the time that I was at Oak Ridge National Lab, DOE was investing significantly in fundamental robotics research. And so they had some of the leading robotics researchers in the world at the time at Oak Ridge National Lab and at other national labs. And so I had a great opportunity to spend some time there. But I began to get more and more interested in impacting students. And so that's why I moved across town. As you probably can tell from my accent, I'm from Tennessee myself, and I wanted to stay in the area. And so moved over to the University of Tennessee where I could continue the research, but also do work closely with students and help train the next generation of students, because that's really, you can't sustain the research if you don't have new people, new blood, new ideas coming into the mix. And that was well and good. And then I would say at some point along the line, VJ actually calls me up or sends me an email and suggests that maybe this NSF opportunity would be a good opportunity. And after that was the division director for overseeing all of the AI investments at NSF. And again, that appealed to me because now I'm fostering not only the, the community, the research community that I'm directly contributing to, or the students that I'm directly working with, but now I'm helping the nation as a whole and really pushing forward the research opportunities as well as the education opportunities in the AI space for the nation as a whole. And so that was very appealing to me, and also got me more interested in an administrative role. So that's when I went back to UT, and as VJ mentioned in the introduction, I was for a period of time interim dean of engineering. But then, you know, when the White House calls, it's a little bit hard to turn that down. And certainly from VJ and his experience at OSTP and others that I've known over the years, I know that there are, again, great opportunities to do work, in this case for the nation. I'm a very patriotic person, and I believe that if we can contribute to helping advance our capabilities and the opportunities and the quality of life in our nation, then if we're given that opportunity, we should take it. And so it's been quite a thrill to be at OSTP. Just a small number of people can actually make a really significant difference. And so I think my overarching message there is just really, I'm always thinking ahead a few years, but, what do I think should happen next? But I don't really think that's necessarily easy to plan out 10 years at a time. But I just encourage people to constantly reevaluate where you are, where you think your skills lie, where your passions lie, where you think the opportunities are for you to make a difference. And then that is your guiding light in determining the different career paths or the transitions that you make over time.
Great, thank you. I think a lot of the graduate students here in the audience could gain a lot from your diverse experience in your graduate education. And so what skills did you gain from your graduate education that had the greatest impact on your career?
Well, of course, I got a PhD at MIT, and at the time it was called the AI Lab. This is prior to it turning into the C-Cell Computer Science and AI Lab. And I think for me, it's not as much about the skills, although obviously the training is critically important. The classes that you take and the very challenging work that you're expected to perform, and the research itself is also all obviously you have to do that. But I think one of the most important things that I learned from graduate school and graduate experience is the importance of recognizing the collaborations with other people, recognizing the sort of the genius of other people, and being able to build on those partnerships, being able to build on the great ideas of the community in terms of the research. And really, it kind of elevates the level of expectation for yourself when you see all of these amazing people around you that are doing really great things, and it helps sort of motivate and elevate your own contributions to match those of your great collaborators. And so I think for me it's an acknowledgement of the fact that the research community is a community, and it is about not only what you do yourself, but also how you contribute and work together and partner with others that are in the field. And so for me, it actually, I think over time, really, again, gave me more of a sense of the fact that the research is important. If you're in a faculty position, the teaching is important, but the service is also critically important for building up that community. And I think being amongst sort of that camaraderie of being in grad school, of working through it, slaving through it together, and then working toward lofty research goals and accomplishments really does help set the mindset of expectations going forward.
Thanks for that answer. Since we are at a robotics lab here, I think we have to ask a few questions about robotics, even though you're focusing on AI over there. So I wanted to ask, from your perspective in the OSTP and from your position out there, what do you see as the most important applications of robotics in the coming decades, and what are you guys keeping your eyes on?
Well, it's hard to say necessarily what's more important than another, because it can be hard to predict. I think there are a lot of important applications of robotics, and certainly NSF, of course, has invested for many years in this concept of co-robots, or robots working with people. And I continue to believe that that is a core type of robotics that will continue to be important for many years. It's the same with AI. I think we are recognizing that these systems are often more helpful if they are working as companions or as guides or assistants to people, as opposed to trying to do something all on their own. And so I think the study of how robots work with people is going to continue to be critically important. And that can cover a lot of different domains. It can cover the healthcare spectrum, it covers transportation, it covers home uses. And so I think for me, that will not be going out of interest anytime soon. So if I had to pick one sort of general topic area, I would say that. I think, another interesting area of robotics, just as in AI, is the whole area of learning, and how because this world is so unpredictable and uncertain and unknown in many cases to a robot, the ability for that robot to learn from its own experiences or learn from other robots and so forth is going to continue to be an exciting and important challenge that, again, applies to a lot of different applications. So I think those are the two areas that I would say are going to continue to be highly important for advancing the field, and also for getting robots out there and actually doing real work.
So one thing we talked briefly about was this notion of AI and robots as assistants, and the role that AI and robotics will have in working with people. As someone who works at OSTP, what do you feel like the public's current outlook is towards AI, and how, if in any way, do you see this changing in the future?
Well, that's kind of a hard question to answer. it's hard because I think the public, it covers so much of the spectrum of people that only know what they read in a magazine versus people that have actually studied it a little bit or have looked into it in just a little bit more detail. I do worry a little bit that because, you know, our culture pretty much likes to have more sensational kinds of stories, that there's more attention to the sensationalism, and I don't have a good sense for whether the public views it as sensationalist or whether they realize, yes, there's that angle to it, but there's also a more mundane angle to it. So, for instance, I think if you think about issues of AI and trust, well, obviously we want to use AI in a way that if it's being used to help a person make a decision, say about a person's access to resources, then we need to make very sure that the way that the AI is providing advice or recommendations or helping in the decision making, we need to make very sure that that advice is based on data that's being applied in an appropriate way. It's representative of the use case, and it doesn't embed things like bias. I worry sometimes, though, that people, because there's so much talk about that people sometimes equate all AI with having that kind of concern. Or, you know, you could say the same thing with certain robotics, although I don't see it as being quite as sensational now, certainly in Hollywood, the Terminator and so forth, all the negative side of robotics. But I think the challenge is if people believe that those kinds of concerns apply to everything, then we're in the danger of not being able to use it at all. And so that's why I think this trust issue is so key. In order to make sure that people don't have a skewed view of all AI or all robotics. It's not all the same. There's so many different applications of AI. There's so many different applications of robotics that concerns or challenges in one area don't necessarily apply to everything. So I think it's important for us to convey to the public that yes, there are concerns, and yes, we absolutely need to address those in the context of where those concerns are applicable. But those concerns don't necessarily apply to everything, and we should not throw out the use of, say, all technology in these areas because we're concerned about a few use cases. We can address these use cases on a case-by-case basis. And that's why the OMB memo that I mentioned, the AI regulatory memo, is so important because it talks about looking at the use of AI in a sector-specific and a use-specific case so that we don't lump it all together. We look at it individually. And that way we can address what's specific to the concerns of a particular use case, but not lump everything into a burdensome expectation that it's actually not relevant. And so I think that applies to AI. I think it also applies to robotics.
Okay, I think we had a question in the chat from Daniel, and he says, how do you think this administration's immigration policies, such as a hostile environment towards international students and the use of computing and ethnic cleansing are affecting American AI competitiveness and our ability to foster AI development based on human rights values?
So I don't have anything to do with immigration policy. I will say that the administration has been very open about wanting to have a merit-based immigration policy, and that merit-based immigration would, in fact, help fields like AI and robotics because more of the people who would be allotted visas and so forth would come from those that are looking at highly skilled areas. In terms of computing for ethnic cleansing, I'm guessing that this has to do with the Uyghur, what China's doing in the use of, it's kind of the authoritarian uses of AI to oppress people and do lots of things that are not consistent with our values in the free world. And the U.S. CTO, Michael Kratsios, talks frequently about the importance of making sure that we are the leaders in AI, because that way we can develop AI in a way that's consistent with our values. We're not able, if we try to not use AI in lots of applications, kind of tied to my previous answer, then we open up the door for authoritarian nations to be leaders in the development of AI, which means then that we don't have the control in terms of trying to make sure that the AI is consistently used with our democratic Western free society values. And so a lot of the actions that take at the international level, whether it be with the Global Partnership on AI or the OECD, are very much with the idea in mind that we want to figure out how the free world can use AI and use it in a positive way, while not allowing authoritarian nations that want to use AI in ways that oppress people. And so we do that by making clear what our values are, but also doing the research that allows us to create AI that not only does a task, but also does a task in a way that is fair and not biased, and it's explainable and so forth, to the extent that the technology allows. And so I think generally these are critically important points that are happening at the kind of the worldwide level, and it is important for like-minded democracies to join together to make sure that collectively we are the hub of AI innovation, so that we can do it and implement it in ways that are consistent with our values.
So you've mentioned that we've already got a couple agreements going here with the OECD and the GPAI to start establishing these common principles on how we should move forward with AI. What are the next steps in international coordination after we've established these common principles?
So it's the implementation of the principles. And I mentioned very quickly the OECD AI Policy Observatory, and that is aimed at how do we go about implementing the principles. The GPAI also is aimed at that objective as well. And so the way that we implement the principles, though, can be different in different cultures. I think we don't want to presume that the way that we might implement something in the United States is necessarily the way they want to implement it in some other nation. But what we can do is work together to see what is working across the world, what people are trying across the world, and then share those practices so that other nations can look at those and see what they believe will apply well to their own culture, their own society. And so the OECD AI Policy Observatory has a very strong effort underway right now to help nations with the implementation of these principles. Same thing with the GPAI. Their goal is to look at the landscape of research and how it can inform the principles so that we can make policies that make sense. For instance, we don't want to, as a nation, it doesn't make sense to make a policy that says all AI shall be explainable to a ninth grade level if there's just simply no technical way to do that for all AI applications. But maybe for certain AI applications, it makes sense to be able to have AI that's explainable at some level. And so by understanding where the state of the research is, we can then that can then inform the policy making so that we're implementing a principle like AI explainability in a way that practically makes sense. Again, this is where technical standards come into play. We have to be able to measure explainability and understand what that even means. So it all ties together. And so that's all of these efforts collectively are going toward the implementation of these policies.
So we have a question in the chat that is asking about how OSTP is specifically addressing trustworthiness. This is also another question that came up is, how are what do these implementations of trustworthiness and fairness actually look like in AI?
Well, I mentioned a number of things for trustworthiness on the AI, on the R&D front. For instance, NSF has research activities on AI and fairness. I mentioned how NIST has a number of ongoing programs in the area of trust, looking at things like explainability or bias and so forth. And at OSTP, our role is to provide the overarching approach, sort of interagency collective strategies and areas of priority that the agencies are working on. So that's one of the key things that we do. We manage a lot of interagency coordination on these kinds of topics. And so we work very closely with all of the agencies in these various areas to advance the research and the technical standards for trust. And then OSTP more directly works on the international front and doing things like serving on delegations that go and iron out what some of these kinds of agreements are, so that then at the umbrella level across all the agencies, we can push actions that advance trust. So trust comes from research, it comes from technical standards, it comes from education, helping people better understand what is and isn't an issue as it relates to AI, and it comes from setting expectations internationally in terms of what, how we want to use these technologies, what is acceptable and what's not acceptable, and how we can, if we need to, set regulatory approaches to make sure that it's being used in a way that is consistent with what a free society expects. So all of these collectively are creating the landscape for trust. It's no one thing that just magically has trust, but all these collectively can foster the trust.
All right, we have one more question from the audience. You shared that there has been an increase in fellowship opportunities for graduate students interested in studying AI. Are there any initiatives targeting professors and instructors to improve the teaching of AI?
OSCP, in terms of particular activities, we talked to a number of professional societies and maybe some nonprofits that are looking at various curricula for helping teachers, maybe not professors so much as it is K through 12 kind of teachers. I think one of the challenges that we run into at K through 12 is, even though the STEM strategy talks about teaching computational thinking and computer-related skills to students, if the teachers don't know how to do that, they don't have the background themselves, then it's difficult. And so we have been engaging with a number of organizations that are looking at these kinds of shared curricula that can help provide these K through 12 type teachers with that background, the resources, the curricula that they need to help them get up to speed, so that then they can teach the students as well. Certainly I know a number of professional societies are looking at things. Again, we're talking a lot about trust, about how you can fold in AI ethics related training into, say at the college level, in different types of AI courses. And so that is an area we actively talk with a number of them to make sure that we understand where the gaps are and where those opportunities are to help spread the word about some of that good work that's happening across the board. So I think at the end of the day, I think the professorship challenge is a challenge of overall lack of enough talent, enough skilled workforce, because certainly industry pays so much right now that a lot of the people who might be a faculty member would be going to industry. And so by having more people, it provides more of a workforce, more opportunities, I think, for people to stay in academia. But I think another thing in terms of professors is it's easier to be a professor, I think, if you're not having to chase funding every moment of every day. And by increasing the overall R&D funding that's available for academia, then you're helping faculty members by providing them research funding that can help them be successful in their faculty positions. So I think all of that together can also help on the sort of the teaching and professorial side as well.
Lynn, we've approached the end of the hour. I wanted to just take the opportunity to once again to thank you for spending a very interesting hour with our faculty, staff, and students. Really appreciate your commitment to everything, but in particular, your service to the country and your dedication to science and technology. So thanks for everything. I'm going to hand it over to Gabby, and she will land the plane.
Thank you, Lynn. Thank you, Vijay, and the panelists. And thank you all for joining us here today. Please tune in on Friday, October 16th at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time for the next Grasp on Robotics speaker, Sami Hadarin from the Technical School of Munich. For more information on upcoming events, be sure to follow us. Oops. Be sure to follow us on social media. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Bye.